last years of the 19th century, that human affairs were being watched from the timeless worlds of space. No one could have dreamed we were being scrutinized as someone with a microscope studies creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Few men even considered the possibility of life on other planets. And yet, across the gulf of space, minds immeasurably superior to ours regarded this Earth with envious eyes. And slowly and surely, they drew their plans against us.
Broadcasting live
from a tiny studio somewhere in North America.
This is Dark Matters Radio Live. And now I give you your host,
the silverback of ufology.
Here's Don Ecker.
And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another edition of Dark Matters Radio. Dark Matters Radio, of course, is brought to you courtesy of KGRA Radio, your contact point to the paranormal and other places even stranger. I've got a show that I've been looking forward to doing on tonight with a gentleman that I have interviewed previously, not on this network, but on my last network, where we discussed in great depth interesting and phenomenal things having to do with our history, our human history. Now, roughly 20 plus years ago, newspaper reporter and author Graham Hancock made an observation in light of one of his books, Handprints of the Gods, where he said basically that we humans, our civilization, is a civilization with amnesia. Now, what exactly was Hancock referring to? Well, the fact that we have a vastly older history than we have any idea of today. For some reason, we basically, somewhere along the way, lost our history. Things in the distant past that today are only in mythology if they even have made it that far. But yet, occasionally, even now, things are popping to the surface. Archaeologists are discovering things that, quite frankly, have set them back on their heels. In North America in the 19th century, when a lot of new discoveries were being reported, especially after the migration to the West, and items, strange artifacts, bones, skulls, were sent back to the then still very new Smithsonian Institution, were considered so provocative that instead of analyzing, studying, and researching these artifacts, they found them so disturbing that the Smithsonian destroyed them and threw them away. Matter of historical record. They've admitted it. So, what does that mean? Well, what it basically means is that there are things that probably in our wildest imaginations today would be beyond the pale if, in fact, we discovered them again. Well, tonight, my guest is a gentleman, like I said, that I have interviewed in the past. His name is Frank Joseph. Frank was the editor-in-chief of Ancient American Magazine from the early to mid 1990s through the beginning of this century. He's the author of many books. Let me just read a few of the titles to you to give you an idea of where his interests lie. Ancient High Tech, the astonishing scientific achievements of early civilizations. Power places and the master builders of antiquity. Atlantis and the coming ice age. Gods and ruins. The destruction of Atlantidia, the lost civilization of Lemuria. Now, Lemuria, like Atlantis, is alleged to have been a lost civilization. And while we hear lots and lots about Atlantis, speculation, research, discoveries, we hear very little about Lemuria. Maybe we'll get into that a bit later. But Frank, I want to welcome you to Dark Matters Radio, and it's a distinct pleasure having you back.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, Don, and I look forward to our discussion tonight because you're pretty well versed in these things, and I hope our listeners find it interesting.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure they will. I'm very sure they will. Well, when I talked to you a bit over, I forget how many weeks ago now it was when we touched base once again. We had a rather stimulating conversation then, but basically what put me on the trail of tracking Frank down once again, I have a book, as a matter of fact, I brought it into the studio with me, called Forbidden History, Prehistoric Technologies, Extraterrestrial Intervention, and the Suppressed Origins of Civilization. And it's edited by J. Douglas Kenyon. Now, this was a book I had received, quite a while ago. As a radio broadcaster, often publishers will send me stuff, hoping that I will find it of interest and bring the authors on, which I have many times over the years. But in this book, there are quite a few vignettes. This is not basically, it's a book of various theses. Frank had quite a few in there, dealing primarily with pre-diluvial civilizations. One of the first articles I read was titled, Plato, the Truth. How does the credibility of the best known chronicler of Atlantis stand up? And that's, how does he stand up today? Now, Frank, let's talk a little bit about Plato. Prior to Plato, nobody then in existence, with the exception of perhaps some temples in Egypt, even had an inkling of the story of this alleged lost civilization, did they?
Well, that's not true, actually. The story of Atlantis has been known long before Plato. The only difference is that these other stories, as you say, were enshrined mostly in temples and so forth. To give you an idea how Plato did not invent the story or the first person to write about it, hundreds or thousands of years perhaps before he was even born, there was a festival in Athens called the Pananthenia. And the Pananthenia was a kind of a carnival or a tribute to the goddess Athena, the founder of Athenian civilization, the goddess of civilization. So it was an important festival. And during this festival of Pananthenia, as part of the celebration, there were a number of these dancers that would perform in public. And these dancers had something known as a peplum, P-E-P-L-U-M. It's a large fluted skirt. And the reason they wore this, it was very unusual to see women wearing such a thing because it was a very archaic, a very old form of dress. And it was meant to epitomize the ancient dance that they were doing. And on this peplum were embroidered stories of Atlantis and the contention between the gods over the existence of Atlantis or its destruction. Now that is known not from Plato. This is discussed in some of the far earlier Greek chronicles, and it is accepted by mainstream archaeologists, always has been, as something that actually happened. So here we have a festival in which these dancers are literally dramatically and visually portraying the Atlantis story on their skirts. Plato doesn't even refer to that. He has two dialogues, they're called, the Timaeus and the Critias. And those names refer to people that were discussing this issue and other issues related to Atlantis. So the point that you raise is interesting. I don't believe the story of Atlantis was as well known to the general public until Plato finally discussed it. He performed something a little bit different than his predecessors. He did not look at it from a mythological or religious point of view. He looked at it from a straight historical point of view. He was a scientist. He was a philosopher. And so he was not as much interested in philosophy and religion as he was in telling, as he said, the truth. That was his great motivation in life, and his whole career was determining what really happened. And that, I think, alone makes the story of Atlantis interesting in his hands, because we're not getting just these fanciful stories, which may be based in truth, but he got to the core essence of Atlantis. And that's why his account is not only still so valuable after 2,400 years, but is still fascinating to read and still the best account that we have, although it's incomplete. We don't have all of it. We have a lot of it, maybe most of it, we don't know, but the end is missing. And when I first began my Atlantean researches many decades ago, I began with Plato, as most Atlantologists do. And I spent many years examining in detail through various translations. I read a little classical Greek, but not enough where I can be fluent in it. And I was able to determine that his account is extremely interesting for the things that it does not say.
Well, two things, Frank.
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I don't want to go rambling on.
No. That's fine. I find it fascinating. But two things I want to ask you about. Now, the critics, the skeptics that have tried to basically downplay Plato's accounts, refer to his ancestor, Solon, a very famous personage in Greek history. Solon the lawgiver had traveled to Egypt. Now, that probably at the time would have been quite a trip, but he went seeking out the temple of Sais, I think that's the correct way to pronounce it, in the Delta, to talk and interview the priests, and they showed him the basic text talking about Atlantis on their temple walls. Now, first off, he was, 150 years before Plato, somewhere around there. Is that about right?
About 600 A.D. I think one of the dates that they have for him is like about 596 or 592 B.C. No one is absolutely correct, but it's right around 560 B.C. Plato flourished around 400 B.C., a little earlier than that, a little later, right around. He straddled
So
that
do
area.
you have any idea what Solon was looking for when he went there?
He was looking for a good time.
Well,
He was on vacation. He didn't know anything about it at all. He did not undertake any kind of a research trip or anything. As you correctly state, he was known as the lawgiver, and not just any lawgiver. Solon is regarded as the first statesman who promulgated laws as we understand them, not just decrees that were before the state ruled through decrees. The king or emperor sent orders down, but that was no longer the case. With Solon, he created the first, you could almost say, democratic law system, and he could not enforce it, as powerful as he was. It was up for debate. And so he created this, took him years to create this law system for governing a high civilization that the Greeks had reached, and then he left it in their hands to decide which of these laws to accept and which to deny. And he felt it would be best if he left Greece. And so he went on a vacation. He left Greece, and he went to Egypt and saw all the sites. And one of the sites to see was in the Nile Delta. It was a huge temple. Archaeologists have found, unfortunately, just the barest outlines of it. It was a great place. It was huge, and it was called the Temple of the Goddess Neith. And he wanted to go there especially because the Egyptian goddess Athena had a lot of things in common with her Egyptian counterpart, Neith. And when he went in there, he talked to a priest. His name was Sancius, probably more like Sebek. We won't go into all that, but anyway, the Egyptian priest in charge, the high priest in charge of the temple, said, "I'd like to show you some of our more interesting collections here, and here is a tablet which we'll translate for you," because Solon could not read ancient Egyptian, "and we'll translate this story." And Solon said, "I'd like to hear about that, especially if it relates to past history of our two countries together." And they said, "Well, this is the one we should read." And so they read the text of Atlantis, in which the story related that the Athenians had defeated the forces of Atlantis, which were invading at that time the Nile Delta. It was a terrific war. It was a kind of world war. It was a gigantic conflagration that involved hundreds of thousands of men over huge distances of the earth, gigantic navies. And a lot of this material exists in more than mythology. And so this story was enshrined in some pretty good detail. And that is what Plato's account is based on, because when Solon returned to Athens, he was so interested in this that he wrote a long text transcribing what he had been told in Egypt. It was called Atlantida, or Atlantikos. Actually, in Greek, it's Atlantikos. And that story was inherited by Plato over the years. It wasn't a secret. People had known about it, but Plato was the first to discuss it.
Well, that was actually the second thing that I wanted to broach with you. This alleged war between Athens and Atlantis. Now, I think we will all agree that if Atlantis truly existed, it was in excess of 10, 11,000 years ago. And Athens was not yet in existence, was it?
Well, you've put your finger on the most controversial aspect of this entire story, because Plato, in his accounts, the Timaeus and the Critias, says that these events happened 9,000 years before his time. In other words, a little more than 11,000 years ago. Well, archaeology has confirmed that 11,000 years ago, Greece was virtually unpopulated. There was no Athens. There wasn't even any Egypt, at least no dynastic Egypt. And nothing like the story that Plato describes could have possibly happened at the end of the last ice age. So what on earth are we talking about? Is this then the whole story is completely discredited? No, because our conception of time today, when we say 11,000 years, is not the same conception of time that the Greeks had, and especially not the conception of time that the ancient Egyptians had. The time that Solon visited Egypt and was being told this story, the Egyptians had no less than 5 different calendars that were operating simultaneously. Some of the calendars were dated entirely on generations of the king. Other calendars were based entirely on, they were stellar calendars on the stars. They had solar calendars, somewhat like we have today, so the time involved is extremely confusing. Now, the Egyptians did say, yes, this happened 11,000 years ago, but not 11,000 of our years. The priests at the Temple of Neith, where the story of Atlantis was enshrined, their calendar they used was the priest's calendar. We know what that priest's calendar was. It was a lunar calendar. So when they're saying that these events happened 11,000 years ago, they're saying 11,000 lunar years ago. Now, if you translate or recompute the 11,000-year date from the lunar calendar into our calendar, the events that are described in the Timaeus and the Critias did not happen 11,000 of our years ago. It happened about 3,000 of our years ago. Now, that's a big difference. It's a crucial difference because Plato's description, which is detailed in many regards, his description does not fit 11,000 years ago as we understand it, but they fit perfectly into 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago was not the Ice Age, it was the Bronze Age. And the weapons, the technology, the city itself, as described by Plato, fits perfectly like a glove into the late Bronze Age. This was a period of time in which the cities were being developed for the first time. You had terrific amount of seamanship going on, a lot of bronze work, obviously, the name bronze. And all these aspects refer just perfectly to Plato's story. So that's the real problem. And there still is a lot of controversy on this. Some Atlantologists say, no, we have to take Plato at his word. It's 11,000 years ago. But they miss the point. The point is that the 11,000 years ago, we're referring to the calendar that was available to the priests that had that story and told it to Solon. That was written down point for point, and that part was lost in translation.
Well, wait a minute, I'm confused. Now, if they're 3,000 years ago from that time...
No, from our time.
From our time?
From our time, the Atlantis story took place about 3,000 years before our time. In other words, we're talking about the 13th to the 15th or 18th centuries BC.
And there was no Atlantis then that we know of, at least.
Yes, there was. That's when Atlantis existed, was during the late Bronze Age, was from about 1600 BC.
Are you talking about the island of Thera? Of Santorini?
No, I'm not talking about that. No, I'm not talking about the island of Thera at all. No.
Okay, now they were often today, Frank, that civilization, which was part of the Minoan culture, that had the catastrophic volcanic eruption, which basically ended up destroying Minoan civilization, has often been claimed, especially by the skeptics, as what Plato was actually talking about. Now, what I am talking about, the mythological Atlantis, there's no, that I'm aware of, there's no historical record of it. Is there?
There is a historical record. The historical record is clear. And the historical record was chiseled into the walls of Medinet Habu, the victory temple of Pharaoh Ramses III, outside Luxor in the Upper Nile. I visited that place. It still is in great shape, relatively great shape. It's a gigantic. It's called the Mansion of Ramses III. It's more than a mansion. It's a gigantic temple. And on its walls are depicted the story of Atlantis. And they refer to it in a similar Egyptian word called Etalenti. They called it Etalenti. They had other names for it too, like Nejeru, place of the gods. But mostly they refer to it as Etalenti. And that is the story. The story is chiseled on the walls of Medinet Habu.
Okay, well, with that, believe it or not, we are at our very first break. Let me take that. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, my guest, my very special guest, Mr. Frank Joseph, and we are talking about his years, decades of research into ancient human history, civilization, the things that probably many of us don't give on a daily basis a heck of a lot of thought to, but good heaven, it is some fascinating material. We've got a lot more coming up. Stick around because we will be back after these words.
OMG! People are jumping on board to the Life Change Tea Regiment. Brew, steep, and drink for a gentle, taste great cleanse. It's changing how they feel. See what everybody's talking about. Log on to getthetea.com. That's getthetea.com. Life Change Tea aids in digestive slowdown and helps people get moving down a healthy path. We won't make claims. We'll just let you decide. Experience is much better than a commercial anyway. If you want results, log on to getthetea.com and purchase your super strength cleansing tea. You won't be disappointed. And if you're looking for some mind-body suggestions, go to YouTube and punch in the search bar Health Matters Now. That's Health Matters Now. Put power into your health now. So, getthetea.com. That's getthetea.com for super strength tea. And YouTube, Health Matters Now. That's Health Matters Now for valuable suggestions. Getthetea.com. The tea that makes you go. Why is it we're not very good with our health regimen until it's too late? We don't put oil in the car until the engine blows up. When the body's out of balance, your health is not so good. Give your body some love. Log on to getthetea.com. That's getthetea.com. Try our Life Change Tea, which cleanses you from harmful intruders. A clean colon is one of the ways to bring the body in balance. We also carry organic supplements to help you get where you need to go. So do your body a favor. Log on to getthetea.com. That's getthetea.com. You can even visit our sales page to save some dough. Does anybody call money dough anymore? Anyway, if you're looking for short, helpful health tips, go to YouTube and punch in Health Matters Now. That's Health Matters Now. So, log on to getthetea.com, shop, get balanced, then learn some cool tips at Health Matters Now. You'll be glad you did. That's getthetea.com.
The Laughlin UFO Mega Conference just announced an incredible addition to the world's greatest UFO event. Saturday, February 15th, we're going to see the final public presentation by Charles Hall. Following him, we will see the world premiere screening of the feature-length documentary based on his life walking with the Tall Whites. And during the 8 days, there will be 38 more world-class presentations. I am so glad we chose to be at the Laughlin UFO Mega Conference 2020 on February the 15th through the 22nd. So go now to LaughlinUFOMegaConference.com and register. You can still make the decision to attend the only not-to-be-missed UFO conference of 2020. It's simple. The world's greatest conference. 39 presentations you won't hear anywhere else. 8 days, lowest cost. Go to LaughlinUFOMegaConference.com. Register now at LaughlinUFOMegaConference.com.
Mainstream media's most wanted. KGRARadio.com.
And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, with Mr. Frank Joseph. Frank, we were off the air during the break. We were mentioning a couple of items. Now, the magic number for me personally, as far as prehistorical records, is around 11,000 years ago. Now, from our present date, in 2020 AD, 11,000 years ago would put the time frame roughly in the vicinity of 9,000 or so BCE, before the Common Era. Now, that seems to be a magic number when it comes to a tremendous catastrophic event which apparently changed the face of our planet, which caused the ice sheets to recede and melt, the oceans to rise, which would have meant that any civilizations at that time would have been at the least uprooted, and many of them probably destroyed. Now, we know that once upon a time here in North America, we were literally overrun by major fauna. In other words, animals, huge animals, things like the great woolly mammoth, the mastodon, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, huge diurnal wolves, animals like that. And then suddenly, in an eye blink, Frank, they're gone. What is your take on that?
There is a site in Siberia. It's a cave. Actually, it's not just a large cave. It's a series of fairly large caves. And at the back of these caves were discovered, it must be going on 100 years ago when they were found. At the back of these caves were found what possibly is 1 million bones. And these are all the bones of extinct animals. And some of these animals, as you said, were gigantic, huge, as big as dump trucks or bigger. And these bones were all hurtled together. They are all hurtled together. This site is still available. You can still go there if you can. It's a hard trek to get there. I haven't been there myself, but these bones, possibly 1 million of these bones, appear as though that they were just literally washed all to the backs of these caves. And that's exactly what happened. These animals were obliterated in the blink of an eye. What kind of power, what kind of unbelievable force could have picked up tens of thousands or more of these animals, sometimes sizable animals, and just washed them into the backs of these caves? They're all dated to around 11,000 years ago. You're absolutely right in describing that as an event horizon. Something of a huge nature took place around the world at that time. Now, before 11,000 years is like right on the cusp of the end of the last ice age. And the last ice age had lasted for over 100,000 years. And ice ages come and go because of the rotation of the planet Earth. The Earth rotates on a kind of a wobble. And when it wobbles away from the sun, when its northern hemisphere gets less direct sunlight, ice ages occur. And then it slowly wobbles the northern hemisphere back, facing the sun, and the direct rays of the sun come back, they melt the ice, and here we are in the Holocene epoch, which is where we are right now. A warm phase. What we are in is a warm phase. It's not like it hasn't always been this way on the Earth, and it will not be this way again. That's just the way it is. But these ice ages can be extremely problematical. When an ice age is ending, it's not just a slow, gradual process. during this process, there are enormous conflicts of temperature, and these temperature differentiations cause enormous storms and changes. Sometimes, to be aided in these changes, there could be an astronomical event, and there's good evidence that there was some kind of a comet or an asteroid that was involved in this process. However it came about, there was a global catastrophe that took place at that time. It ended the Ice Age, but at that same time, our species had been doing great things. You've probably all heard about the caves at Lascaux, the cave art there, high cultural achievements. The Magdalenian period, which was just before the Ice Age ended, was like the beginning of modern agriculture, actually, the beginnings of it. When the planet warmed up, then it allowed people to get larger populations, and from these larger populations came the urban centers, and the urban centers produced civilization. And that really is why 11,000 years ago is such an important period. It really represents the birth of our civilization. Our civilization does not go back just a couple of thousand years ago. Our civilization goes back over 10,000 years ago, and Atlantis is part of this story. It is not the whole story. Just because I believe in Atlantis and I realize that it was a place that really existed, I don't believe that it explains everything. It's just an interesting, very interesting and important part of it. Probably Atlantis is particularly important because, well, people find fascination in it because it resembles us so much. The comparisons between the condition of our civilization now and the end of Atlantis are very close. They're very close parallels. It's a little eerie. We're seeing the historical mirror being held up a little too closely for us, I suppose. That's what we find, I think, so fascinating about Atlantis, is because we see ourselves in that. A high civilization, technologically way far ahead of everything, rich as could be, wealthy, on top of the world, and they lost it all.
Well, a few months ago, I interviewed on this show Dr. Heather Lynn, who is an archaeologist, and she has a very deep fascination into these epics, these periods of time. And we began chatting about Göbekli Tepe. All right. Now, this was a site that before several decades ago, nobody even knew existed. And suddenly a farmer out there in Turkey, where this site is located, ran into a big rock or stone. Before you know it, he realized they had ruins of some type beneath his feet. He notified the authorities. They brought in the academics. They began doing some exploratory digging, and they discovered this amazing site, dated 11,000 years ago from our time. Now, what they have discovered there, and only a small fraction of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. They know from ground-penetrating radar there's much more. I guess it's a toss-up whether they even at this point plan to dig up more of these artifacts. But when Heather Lynn and I were discussing this, and it was on the cusp of the end of the Ice Age, I referred to those human beings going through there. And apparently this seemingly held great religious importance to them as refugees. And she absolutely agreed. Now, what do I mean by refugees? Well, survivors that fled a doomed civilization because of what was happening around them. Obviously, they were highly skilled, Frank. They were not the hunter-gatherers that many in the academic community would have you believe, because of the excellence of these carvings, these pillars and these altars that have been discovered. Would you agree with that?
Well, sure. The interesting thing about Göbekli Tepe is that some of the bas-relief carvings that appear on the flanks of these magnificent pillars and stones, these are the same images that are found in our modern zodiac. For example, Scorpio and so on. Scorpio has been positively identified there. There's a lot more that have been, and others that are not quite so sure. But it appears that Göbekli Tepe was a kind of a astrological temple, or it was a temple that was associated with various constellation positions in the night sky. Until really fairly recently, over the past several hundred years, there was no distinction between astrology and astronomy. Astronomy was and still is simply the observation of the heavens. Astrology was the metaphysical interpretation of the relationship of the heavens to life here on Earth. And that concept of the unity of astrology and astronomy you find all through the ancient world, and you find it at Göbekli Tepe as well. There are a couple of other really disturbing things about that. Göbekli Tepe also has these T-shaped columns, very beautifully done, but they look kind of unusual. But you do find those same T-shaped columns at other megalithic sites, much later megalithic sites, say on the island of Majorca, off the coast of Spain. You have a megalithic site that goes back, it's got to be at least 4,000, maybe 5,000 years, but that's still long after Göbekli Tepe. And here you find these T-shaped columns. And on these T-shaped columns at Göbekli Tepe, there are representations of anthropomorphic figures, humans, that have their long hands and arms and fingers oriented towards their navel. Well, what's so special about that? They bear a stylistic resemblance, an identifiable stylistic resemblance to the Moai, or the great stone figures of Easter Island on the other side of the world. Easter Island was known originally not as Easter Island. That was the name given to them by Europeans, by the Dutch explorer who found the place in 1720. But the original name of Easter Island was the navel of the world, Rapa Nui. And the name of Göbekli Tepe also means navel hill, the hill of the navel. So I don't pretend to know all of these connections, but they are there nonetheless. It's interesting. Are we talking about a global civilization that existed 11,000 years ago? Perhaps we are. Perhaps we are talking about a global civilization. Easter Island, for example, had a written language called Rongo Rongo, which just means sounds. That written language was almost totally destroyed. This written language appeared on a number of these boards that were, it's a written language, very unusual, very unique, except that language, Rongo Rongo on Easter Island, in the eastern Pacific, this small little dot of an island, it's absolutely identical. It's like a mirror image of the Indus Valley script that you see on the other side of the world again, in India, which is also indecipherable. But if you compare Rongo Rongo, Easter Island's written language, with the Indo-European, the Indus Valley script at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and all these other great centers of ancient Indus Valley, the two languages, written languages, are virtually identical. So how can we explain these commonalities except that there must have been, I conclude that there must have been a global civilization at one time that defied distances and that unified the planet in a civilization that we are only just beginning to glimpse.
Well, with that being said, then let us insert something else into this discussion. Some man, as a matter of fact, my friend, buddy, and co-host on our open line show, Richard Saraday, has had decades-long interest and study into the prophecies and writings of Edgar Cayce. And Cayce, during his lifetime, many of the readings Cayce made dealt with people and previous lives in Atlantis. And the implication from many of these readings were that Atlantis had a very high technological civilization. Now, if you're correct, Frank, and you certainly are not the first to suggest a worldwide civilization at that time, what would your speculation be as to how high technologically these peoples may have been? Now, I realize this is, at this point, pure speculation, but what would your mind tell you about that?
Well, I don't think it's pure speculation, because we do have the remnants of an extremely high technology that we know that existed, that of a level of technology that we do not have today. I'll give you one example. In the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, there are the remains of copper mines that go back right to this period that I'm discussing, from 3000 BC to 1200 BC. This, I think, is the last stages of the Atlantis period. And during this time, on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you can still see on an island called Isle Royale especially, and Isle Royale has literally many hundreds of these pit mines that still exist. Now, these pit mines have been dated by archaeologists to go back to these time periods that I've mentioned, actually even earlier than 3000 BC. It's called the copper culture. And these pit mines, they're just shafts. They are vertical shafts. They will go down sometimes 60 feet through solid rock. Now, how is it possible that a pre-industrial people were able to excavate hundreds and actually thousands of these mines along the Kewanee Peninsula and at Isle Royale? How is it possible that they would excavate these pit mines that go down 60 feet or more through solid rock? Not only that, the amazing thing about these mines, these copper mines, is that the people who used these mines somehow had a technology that could take them exactly to where the copper was. Now, one of these shafts are probe shafts, which are still done today. All of the shafts that are found on Isle Royale and the Kewanee Peninsula of Upper Michigan, each one of these thousands of shafts, the persons who dug them knew exactly precisely where the copper veins were. Now, sometimes the copper veins will outcrop. You can see them on the surface. They come up on the land, and there it is. That's a minority. Most of them are deep underground. So what kind of technology did they have at that time?
I got an even better question. Oh, I'm sure you do. It's obvious that those peoples over that period of time had taken out thousands upon thousands of tons of copper. Thousands of tons. What in the hell were they doing with it? Where is it today?
That's a wonderful question, which mainstream archaeologists don't dare touch. Between 3000 BC and 1200 BC, now get this is a conservative estimate, between 3000 BC and 1200 BC, when the mines were mostly in operation, a conservative minimum of 1.2 billion pounds of the world's highest grade copper were removed from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And when that copper was removed, it vanished. None of it has been found. all of those mines that have been studied for well over 100 years yielded 1.2 billion pounds of the world's highest grade copper and vanished away. It's not such a big mystery, because what was going on in the rest of the world at that time? Well, what I mentioned, the Bronze Age. And in order to make bronze, you have to have three basic elements: zinc, tin, and mostly copper. And it better be high-grade copper. We have to understand that copper at that time was the nuclear fusion of its day. Because if you had an army equipped with bronze swords, you had a technological edge over any other army that was still using copper. Sometimes they just used copper by itself, it was too soft, or sometimes they would use stone or hardened wood. But if you had bronze, you had a light, resilient weapon that could hold its edge far better than anything else. And that's why copper was so important, and that's why they mined it in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and that's why it disappeared. It disappeared in the Near East. It disappeared to Atlantis, and it disappeared to Europe.
Well, that would presuppose they had to have, those peoples would have had to have had logistics that would be envied even today. They would have to have transportation. They would have to have a bureaucracy keeping an eye on that. I mean, we're talking about a real ongoing concern, aren't we?
You bet. Absolutely. What you're talking about, of course, is a highly advanced urban society, a highly organized society that knew exactly what it was doing. You know, when men are motivated by potential for great profit, they can do wonderful things. And that's exactly what was involved. The copper barons of the ancient world, Atlantis especially, they were motivated by this huge profit motive, because if they had a monopoly on copper, which they did, well, then they had a lot of customers that vied for their copper. And Plato, interestingly enough, how this fits in so well, Plato describes Atlantis as a copper-based economy. Everything about the story of Atlantis deals with a mineral that Plato refers to as orichalcum. Well, what does orichalcum mean? That's the Latin of it. In Greek, it's orichalk. Orichalk means nothing more than very high-grade copper. And that's what the Atlanteans based their wealth on and their power, and that's why they came to America. It fits
so
all
your supposition is that Atlantis was in, or at least part of it was in North America?
No, I think that the Atlanteans came to North America, and they came here specifically for our copper. Another indication of that, if you want to, as part of the evidence that you can present, there is a spot in Louisiana, northeastern Louisiana. It's called Poverty Point. And Poverty Point is the oldest city in North America. Goes back to 1500 BCE, probably a little earlier, but archaeologists say, yes, this was made around 1500 BC. And it's an interesting city because it's made of concentric rings, alternating moats of water with rings of land. 5 and 6 are the numbers that are repeated at Poverty Point. It is a dead ringer for Atlantis, because Plato also describes Atlantis as embodying the sacred numerals 5 and 6 and alternating rings of land and water moats intersected by canals. That is precisely the architecture that is seen at Poverty Point. So what I'm saying is that the Atlanteans came to North America to mine the copper, and they used Poverty Point as the clearinghouse for this copper. Poverty Point is located in a warm part of North America. The mining season up in the Upper Peninsula, then as now, would have been circumscribed. You had to be in there by late spring, and you had to be out of there by early fall at the very latest, because the winters drop a heavy hammer on anybody that's trying to work at that time. And they brought that raw copper down the Mississippi. They dropped it off at Poverty Point, where it was smelted and prepared for being sent back to Atlantis, where it was sold to the Bronze Age kingdoms of Greece and Egypt and all the rest of them, Ireland and the rest. And that is the basis for the story of Atlantis more than anything else. So there's some of your hard evidence, as much hard evidence as I can give you over the phone. I have a lot more details in my books. They outline this. One book I
Well, Frank, hang on.
Yeah.
We're almost at the top of the hour break.
Okay.
I don't want you to get into a story that I'm going to have to break you off. But
that's okay.
that's
fine.
Yeah, I have gotten a couple of questions from our chat lounge, and here's one that I want to ask you about before we go to break. This is from, I believe it's pronounced Axella, in our chat lounge, and Axella asks that. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
I'm here.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, and do you have any hypothesis as to why those people would have buried those monuments?
As far as I'm concerned, and I've read Andrew Collins' wonderful book on it, and he suggests, and I agree with him, they buried it because they didn't want anybody else to have it. They had to leave for one reason or another. They didn't want anybody. It was a sacred site. They didn't want to just leave it for strangers to come and occupy. They may have buried it with the intention of coming back someday, but they never did. But I believe that their main impetus was to bury Göbekli Tepe, to keep it as their own. The Maya did the same thing, by the way. The Maya buried cities. You can go to Copan and other cities where the Mayas also buried whole cities. Hard to believe, but they did that.
Okay, Frank, we've got to take that break. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight my very special guest, Mr. Frank Joseph. We've got another whole hour coming up with Frank. In the meantime, keep your eyes pointed up. We'll be back.
What UFO convention are we going to this year?
We're going to the Laughlin UFO Mega Conference February 15th through the 22nd.
I went to their website, LaughlinUFOMegaconference.com, and confirmed we're going to see the best speaker lineup ever offered.
Yes, the greatest gathering of scientists, researchers, and experiencers ever assembled in one place and time. 39 great new presentations over 8 days.
And all at the lowest cost, including 3 social party meal nights with drinks. The Laughlin UFO Mega Conference out contacts That Thing in the Desert. It out ancient histories, That Alien Con Job. And it out internationals, the International UFO Congress, bringing us 9 speakers from out of the USA this year alone.
8 days in Laughlin, February 15th through 22nd. The best speaker lineup ever. Incredible disclosures. Lowest cost for the best event.
Go to LaughlinUFOMegaconference.com. That's LaughlinUFOMegaconference.com. Register now.
OMG! People are jumping on board to the Life Change Tea Regiment. Brew, steep, and drink for a gentle, taste-great cleanse. It's changing how they feel. See what everybody's talking about. Log on to getthetea.com. That's getthetea.com. Life Change Tea aids in digestive slowdown and helps people get moving down a healthy path. We won't make claims. We'll just let you decide. Experience is much better than a commercial anyway. If you want results, log on to getthetea.com and purchase your super strength cleansing tea. You won't be disappointed. And if you're looking for some mind-body suggestions, go to YouTube and punch in the search bar Health Matters Now. That's Health Matters Now. Put power into your health now. So, getthetea.com. That's getthetea.com for super strength tea. And YouTube, Health Matters Now. That's Health Matters Now for valuable suggestions. Getthetea.com. The tea that makes you go.
Nancy Vernon here with Ozark Mountain Publishing, coming to you from the Ozark Mountains of Northwest Arkansas. We are a publisher of New Age, metaphysical, spiritual, nonfiction books, as well as digital downloads, DVDs, and audiobooks. This is also the home of all of Dolores Cannon's titles. The company was founded in 1992 and has been bringing to you a varied selection of titles covering many different subjects. This year, we have added a new imprint to our company, Big Sandy Press. They will be publishing titles from the genres of historical historical fiction and nonfiction, paranormal fiction, and more. So be sure to visit our website, ozarkmt.com, and explore all the new and exciting authors and titles coming your way.
For more information about Ozark Mountain Publishing or their events, call 800-935-0045. That's 800-935-0045, or visit their website at ozarkmt.com. That's ozarkmt.com.
You listen to us, and we listen to you. And so does the CIA. KGRAradio.com.
And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, with hour number 2 of this edition of DMR with my special guest, Mr. Frank Joseph. Frank, before we had to go to break, you were talking about this site in what is present-day Louisiana, Poverty Point. And
yes, that's correct.
Yes, and you're speculating that they had copper smelters there. I had a question come in from one of our users in our chat lounge. This is from our user Blue Orb. And he said that he asks, how is it that none of these copper cargo ships have ever been found as shipwrecks? They must have been great sailors indeed if they never lost any. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's a very excellent question. Before I get on to that, I don't speculate that there are smelters that have been found in the ruins of Poverty Point. They have been found. There is a little island in the Mississippi that's associated with Poverty Point. It's right in the vicinity of Poverty Point. And I guess the last 5 or 7 years, some of the smelters have been found that were used by the ancient inhabitants of Poverty Point, and they are copper smelters. So that's some real physical evidence. Now, as far as not finding the ships, well, the ships were made of very perishable material. There have been some ancient ships that have been found, some shipwrecks from thousands of years ago, but very, very few. And the only reason why these ships have been found, I'm thinking of one, especially the Galedonia wreck off the coast of Turkey, is because they happen to have settled so far beneath the bottom of the sea that they've been relatively well preserved. As an example, look at the Titanic, which has only been under the sea for a little more than 100 years, and it's not in good shape. And speculation is that the sea worms and the corrosion and everything else is eventually dismantling it, and that's the way it is. Wooden ships are far more vulnerable to the types of erosional processes that are taking place under the ocean. So it's not at all surprising that we haven't found any of these ships yet.
Well, if they had a load of copper ingots on board, the copper would still be around.
The copper would still be around. That is absolutely correct. And it's conceivable that possibly some of these piles may have been found and not properly identified. I would agree. Even more fascinating than that, around Isle Royale that I mentioned earlier, where so much of this ancient copper came from, the waters there are very deep and very cold, so that if a vessel sank there, and I'm sure that some must have, over the course of time from 3000 BC to 1200 BC, there is a good chance that several shipwrecks, Atlantean shipwrecks, may still be found in the waters of Isle Royale. The trouble is, there has been no attempt to look for them. The depths there are quite profound. We're talking like 700 or 600 feet. And that's very costly to go down and to mount an expedition to find these things. So it takes money and investments and a lot of hard work and absolute top state-of-the-art technology. But I think that if a determined effort were made, if I had, say, unlimited funds and the time to do it, my start of looking for Atlantis would be in Lake Superior, around Isle Royale, and looking for some of those ancient ships. I think that it's possible. Now, one more thing I say on this, because this is an excellent point that this caller brings up, is that it would appear, and I don't know for sure, but it would appear that 2 anchors from the Bronze Age have been found on the south shore of Lake Superior. They're held by a man who had his own museum. I don't think he's in good enough health now to maintain them. His name is Scott Mitchum. I've seen these anchors, and from what I can tell, they closely resemble the type of stone anchors that were used during the Bronze Age. And he found 2 of them close to shore on the south end of Lake Michigan, and Lake Superior, I should say. And I think that might be good evidence. And there's certainly these anchors tempt one to go further out around Isle Royale and look there.
You know, when I was in school back in the 60s, I can remember we had like book clubs where you could, order books from these academically approved booksellers. And I can remember ordering several by Frank Edwards. Frank Edwards, of course, was somebody, had been a radio broadcaster, had been a writer, an author, and he was somebody that was really involved in these mysteries like we're talking about tonight. And I remember, and I don't recall which book of his, but I remember there was a story in there about a mysterious gravesite that had been discovered up around where you're talking about, Frank, up in Michigan, around these copper pits, that they uncovered the remains. Now, this is the part that was extremely weird. Bodies that had been wrapped in copper armor. Okay. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part were that the remains the skulls had what appeared to be some type of horn protrusion coming out of these skulls, almost like a demon. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am, and that is not the only site where skulls have been found that have protrusions that resemble horns. They're not necessarily demonic.
Well, no. I wasn't suggesting they were, but demonic-like.
No, they could pass for devils, obviously, if you have a skull with horns on. It is a medical condition. I forgot the name of it because I haven't looked into this for some years. It's a medical condition that does take place sometimes. We have to understand that the ancient peoples and Native American peoples today, or indigenous peoples in general, if they find either particularly odd behavior amongst somebody in their own tribe or whatever, or there's something physical that distinguishes them somehow, they feel these people have been set aside by the gods for one reason or another. And when they do that, they usually revere these people rather than condemn them or expel them. And so when persons would have this condition, and there are people today that still have this condition where they'll grow little horns on their heads. It has to do with some kind of a major calcium imbalance, if I recall correctly. And when these people were found in ancient times, they were probably revered. And so when they maybe had a special life, as it were, or they regarded as sacred somehow, they have things like that now. When I was in Peru, and Bolivia some years ago, I noticed that the native people, even then, would refer to anything that looked unusual as something set aside by the gods to attract attention and was to be revered, whether it was a stone or even a person. So I think that's how that's explained. I would suggest.
Well, at the time, the implication was that these beings or these peoples or entities, whatever they were, had some association with that copper mining consortium up there.
Oh, yes. Yeah, so it's a wonderful find. And we have found people in copper armor that are in an ancient context. There's a place called Spiral Mounds in Oklahoma, and it's a magnificent set of mounds. It's open to the public, and I hope our listeners get a chance to go there someday if they're not familiar with it. And when they were first excavated, in a very amateurish, destructive way, unfortunately, back in the early 1930s, a burial was found of a man with a copper breastplate, and that copper breastplate was on display for some time in the local museum there. I don't know what's become of it since, but it did exist. And that sounds very European or Near Eastern, rather than something that Native Americans would be interested in. There are other instances of copper armor that have been found from usually Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where the copper was mined, all the way down to Louisiana that I mentioned. There have been these burials found from time to time. And they suggest, to my mind, that these are what were known as the Sea People, the Menominee Indians, who still exist today, and they existed at one time in greater numbers around the Kewanee Peninsula in upper Michigan. They said, and they will still tell you, that the ancient copper miners were fair-skinned, light-eyed, who came across the sea, and they wounded Mother Earth. That's what they said. They wounded Mother Earth by extracting copper, and that sometimes they would deck themselves out in this copper. The Menominee do not have a very good memory of these people. They later fought them and exterminated a lot of them. But nonetheless, that story is still prevalent today in Menominee tradition. I heard it firsthand from some Menominee that I knew. I read about it beforehand, and many years ago, a couple of decades ago, 20 or 30 years ago, I was lucky enough to meet up with some Menominee wise men, elders, and they shared that story with me. So I thought that was what they're talking about. I think are these Atlanteans who found out that there were these large, rich deposits of the world's highest grade copper, and they knew the industrial potential of this, and they came here in their great ships and they mined it. Now I know that that's very heretical. Mainstream archaeologists won't accept it, but these same archaeologists are unable to explain how 1.2 billion pounds of the world's highest grade copper was mined and vanished. Well, the story, I think, is in Plato's Timaeus and Critias.
Okay, now I have some more questions that have come in from our chat lounge. This is from Richard Bott. He said, what does Frank know about the video of giant pyramids and columns found roughly 2,000 feet underwater off the coast of Cuba?
Well, that was very interesting. That was found about 20-some years ago by a woman by the name of Zelinsky. She and her husband were hired by the Castro government to find rich oil deposits around Cuba. And they did not succeed in doing that, but they, in an accidental way, random way, they found what appears to be the remains of a pyramidal structure and related pyramidal structures at great depths around Cuba. We're talking about many thousands of feet. And it's a very controversial find. Columns were not found. As far as I know, columns were not found or anything. They were like pyramidal structures. I've seen some of the imagery. It's sonar imagery. No photographs, so far as I know, were taken. And I cannot honestly tell you what these things are. Let's say, for example, that the structures at the bottom of the sea around Cuba are, in fact, the pyramidal remains of some previous culture. How is it conceivable that they would get to such incredible depths? We're talking like 3,000 and more feet below the surface. How would they get intact down that far beneath the surface of the sea? I don't understand the geological parameters of such a discovery. I don't believe that Zelinsky faked these things. It's conceivable that we're looking at natural volcanic formations that have been distorted somehow by the sonar signal. That is a possibility. I'm not saying that's what it is. That whole question of the Cuban discovery has sort of faded away because Zelinsky has disappeared with her husband. I have no idea what became of them. People have tried to locate them. They want to find more information about this. The Cuban government is absolutely mum on the subject. Even after Castro's death, they share no information about it whatsoever, certainly not to outsiders like Americans. So I don't really know what those images are. I tend to think, and this is just my personal take on it, I could be completely wrong, but I tend to think that they are natural formations that sometimes nature can look very much like human things. We have to be very careful on these things.
Well, what about Yonaguni, Frank?
Yonaguni, it's called Yonaguni. Now, that's something totally different. Yonaguni is in about 100 feet of water off the coast of this little almond-shaped island, the very southernmost of the Ryukyu Islands, the island chain that extends all the way from mainland Japan. And in 1988, a Japanese scuba diver found this structure by accident. It is definitely man-made. There's no question about it. There have been, so far as I know, about 9 or 11 professional geologists and oceanographers who have examined this structure, and of those 9 or 11, all of them concur that it is man-made, except for, I think, 2 or 3 that are not quite sure about what it is. Professor Masakai Kimura is the top geologist in charge of that site, and he and his students investigated that site at Yonaguni for quite a few years. Their report is beyond a shadow of a doubt the most detailed and convincing report that this is a real structure. You know, this should have been worldwide news. This should have completely changed our view of the past. That structure, which is like a large pyramidal shape with stairs and carvings that look like a giant turtle, this site, being 100 feet underwater, has got to be many thousands of years old, because the last time the water levels were that low, we're going to have to go back like 7,000 or more years ago. The only conclusion you can draw, that can only be drawn from Yonaguni, is that some high civilization created this pyramidal structure when their water was low enough for people to make this place. And that's got to be upwards of 10,000 years ago. That is enough to completely rewrite the history books, but we hear nothing about it, which is quite a sad comment, I think, on the condition of modern archaeology. They will not admit this site. It's not the only one like that. Off the coast of India, there are underwater sites that have yielded literally hundreds and hundreds of artifacts. They're not as deep as Yonaguni, but they're still pretty deep. I think they're 30 to 50 feet deep, which also indicates that these structures were made so long ago when the water levels were 50 or more feet lower than they are today. So you're finding these structures that indicate there was a high level of civilization thousands and thousands of years ago, but archaeologists are afraid to touch it.
Well, that's once again the indication that the Ice Age destroyed many, many areas of human civilization.
Absolutely. If you were to go back, let's say in an airplane, and you could fly back in time, and you would say, fly over Florida or New York, the coast there, and you would look at what that area of the world, what our country, what the outlines of the United States, of North America looked like about 11,000 years ago, you'd be shocked, because there would be something like 500 extra miles of coastline going straight out into the sea. When I went to school back in the 1960s, my geology teacher told me told us, everybody in class, that at the end of the last ice age, before the water began to rise, that the glaciers had locked up enough ice to lower the level of the ocean by 100 feet. Well, that was back in the 1960s, the early 60s. Today, geologists know that the water level before the ice began to melt was almost 500 feet. The consensus for that now is well over 300. It's pushing towards 400 feet, and geologists are now beginning to talk that nearly is probably more like closer to 500. We're talking about the entire world ocean was 500 feet, possibly, certainly 300 to 400 feet lower than it is today. When those glaciers melted, and they didn't just melt in a trickle over the course of many centuries, sometimes they did melt slowly, and other times there were these spates, these surges of tremendous melt-off in which the oceans of the world catastrophically were flooded and raised. Well, naturally, that would have totally wiped out any high culture that existed back then. And we're finding the remnants of it now off the coast of India and Yonaguni and southern Japan. These places really did exist. So our species, as a civilizing species, does not go back just to Egypt or Sumer. It goes back much earlier than that. And these civilizations have come and gone. Maybe just like ours is. Ours has come, and maybe ours is going to.
As the Ice Age began to end, Frank, we were earlier talking about the megafauna that inhabited North America. But there were also humans here that today we collectively refer to as the Clovis people because of the spear points and arrowheads, the beautiful spear points and arrowheads these people created, which incidentally have been found all over the continent. Okay. Those people vanished. Do you think they were another casualty of whatever it was that ended the megafauna?
Doesn't appear so, because the Clovis seem to have lived well into that period. It doesn't. We're so far back, and I'm so ignorant on the details of this. They could have. There are many ways that species go extinct. There are diseases like the one we're facing today, coronavirus, or the Black Plague, which killed many millions of people. There are various ways that species become extinct. Sometimes they're the victims of genocide. They're wiped out by another human tribe. But it's interesting that the Clovis did persist until about 11,000 years ago. We come back to that date again, that event horizon. So perhaps they were swallowed up along with all of the great megafauna that you mentioned, and it's conceivably possible. I would not rule that out. They were not the first by any means here. The Clovis were regarded for many, many years by academia as the earliest humans who walked across a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, no more than about 12,000 years ago. Well, all that's been knocked into a cocked hat by the terrific finds that are being made all over the Americas. We're finding that human beings have been in the Americas for many hundreds of thousands of years. And there's a site that's just outside of Mexico City, Huatlaco, in which there is positive, solid, irrefutable evidence that there were people building fires outside of Mexico, what later became Mexico City, 250,000 years ago, that long ago. And even older places in Argentina. I go that into my book Before Atlantis. So the history of our species is really in the process of being rewritten. And when these finds are made, new chapters and a new appreciation of our very deep past are coming to light.
Okay, I've got another question from one of our users, John Ostains. And John wants to know, how early does Mr. Joseph think Eastern Hemisphere humans, hominids, reached the Western Hemisphere, and how did they manage to cross the Great Divide?
Interesting, wonderful question. I do not pretend to know the finalized answer to this because so much is still being learned. However, there have some things have come to light that explain part of the question that John raises. How, for example, did they arrive here? We know of one migration of people 18,000 years ago, and these were people from Western Europe. They were, for their time, in possession of a relatively high culture. We know that because of the beautiful artwork they've left behind on their cave walls. We also know from the remains of some of their boats that they used that they were adventurers who went far out into the sea. They were not just people who did coastal fishing. We know that because they had harpoons for hunting whales far from shore. We also know that some of the bones that they brought back belonged to fish that were deep sea fish. So these were seafarers. How is it possible that people 18,000 years ago could have sailed here? It is not as difficult as it may seem, although you needed to be pretty hardy to do it. At that time, 18,000 years ago, there was the ice pack phenomena. The ice pack phenomena literally connected northern Europe, especially, say, Scotland, through Iceland and Greenland, all the way to Baffin Island off the coast of North America, was contiguous ice. So you could, if you were brave enough and you were ambitious enough and greedy enough perhaps, you could go out in your tough boats, and you knew already how to do deep sea fishing, so you could live off of the sea by following the pack ice all the way across the North Atlantic into North America. And that is how we believe these early people around 18,000 years ago arrived in North America. They were by no means the first, but this was an early migration. These people are associated with the so-called Clovis because the points, the identifiable Clovis points that we find in the American Southwest especially, mostly, are the same Clovis, the same points exactly, the same manufacturer that are found in France about the same time also, 18,000 or less years ago. So how is it possible that these people from Western and Northern Europe could have arrived here? Well, by following the pack ice. We can't just follow archaeology. Archaeology in itself it does not have the breadth necessary. We also have to include geology, oceanography, astronomy, and yes, even astrology. All these sciences have to be combined to give us a more broad and detailed picture of our ancestors. You can't just follow one of these disciplines. That's why an archaeologist, he's very good at his work of what he does, but he's very subjective, very specific, and it's useful information that the archaeologist brings us. But to understand it in the greater context, to make more sense of it, the geologists have to step in, along with the oceanographers and all the rest. And that's why we understand now how these Western Europeans and Northern Europeans did come to America. we're told that the first European in the Western Hemisphere was Christopher Columbus in 1492.
Yeah, I never believed that. Now,
well,
these.
No, he was a great man. It does not take away from him. He was a great navigator, and he was, but he was not the first. He was rather the last.
Yeah, well, he also didn't end up on North America, Frank. He ended up in the Caribbean.
Well, yes, that's all right. That's right.
No, but I'm just saying. I'm just saying, and there's a heck of a lot of evidence that Vikings got here long before Columbus. But with that being said, there was another area I wanted to discuss with you, because in the last 10, 15 years, a lot of very strange, weird stories have been emanating out of it. The Antarctic. There seems to have been perhaps some type of discovery down there. And from everything I've read and from people I have spoken to, the implication is some very ancient artifacts and areas may have been discovered in the Antarctic, which perhaps can also be dated back to that magic time of about 11,000 years ago. What have you heard or perhaps research concerning that, the Antarctic?
There was a very brilliant man. His name was Professor Charles Hapgood.
Oh, yeah.
And Professor Hapgood, I won't go into the long aspects of this, he came into possession of something called the Piri-Reis map. The Piri-Reis map is now held at the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul, Turkey. Piri-Reis means the admiral. And this was a Turkish seafarer who compiled this interesting map from a number of other older maps. He lived just shortly before the time of Christopher Columbus. And he was also a kind of a seafarer. Piri-Reis means just literally the admiral. And he tried to make a world map based on all of the other maps that he had at his disposal. We don't know what those maps are. They're all gone. But those maps have been traced back, some of them to the time of Ptolemy in Alexandria, ancient Alexandria, and earlier still. But the interesting thing about these maps, Professor Hapgood found, is that if these maps were compiled in the 14th and 15th centuries AD, and they were based on maps that were thousands of years older, how is it possible that they accurately depict the coastline and even much of the interior of Antarctica, which wasn't discovered from the time of the earliest maps, thousands of years later, supposedly? Professor Hapgood asked this question of his university students, and together they did a thorough investigation of the Piri-Reis map. When they came to their conclusions, they were astounded and could hardly believe them, and Professor Hapgood submitted these conclusions to none other than his friend Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein endorsed them, said that he had done professional work. His conclusions are valid. We haven't heard anything since then about it. Hardly. And the Piri-Reis map that Charles Hapgood, with the endorsement of Albert Einstein and the work of his university students, showed that these maps, which perhaps go back as much as 4,000 years, Hapgood said. He says there are evidence that these earliest maps, that the Piri-Reis map is based on, are 4,000 years old. They show incredible accuracy. It would be completely impossible for circumstantial cartographers to come up with the precision and accuracy of this map. Not only that, it also shows Venezuela in a strange way, in a very inaccurate way. When Professor Hapgood then examined the coast of Venezuela as it was shortly after the ice melted, the map on the Perry Reese map matched the coast of Venezuela exactly. So somebody had knowledge of what Venezuela looked like long, long ago. Extending their research, when they found that out, they found that there were many areas of Antarctica which looked very unfamiliar. They did the same computer backlogging, as it were, and they found that this is the kicker of it all. The Perry Reese map accurately shows areas of Antarctica without the ice. In other words, maps were made by somebody of Antarctica before there was ice on it. How is that possible?
Well, it would seem to indicate there may have been human habitation there.
And that's right. There are indications on the maps of animals and people and cities on Antarctica. And this is the same map that shows accurately the coast of Antarctica if you remove the ice. And that information, by the way, about what the coast of Antarctica looks like under the ice was not available until 1956, 57. That was the physiological year in which they, through sonar testing, they were able to determine what the coast of Antarctica really looks like without the ice. But that was not known until the mid-1950s. And yet it appears on the Perry Reese map that goes back perhaps 4,000 years ago. So there is obviously a very high culture, a very old culture that knew what Antarctica looked like without the ice.
But Hapgood also theorized, and I tend to think he was onto something, about Earth crustal shifting. Now, if that Perry Reese map is correct, and it shows what today is the Antarctic sans ice, that might suggest that it was in a different position on the planet, Frank, which would have made it much more habitable.
Well, I find that very difficult to accept. I think it is far easier to accept that there has been major climate change over the past several thousand years, and that we don't have to really go to the extent of moving an entire continent toward the equator or so forth.
Well, you're familiar with Hapgood's theory, right?
Yes, and I think that Hapgood's, there seems to be no doubt that his research on the map is spot on. I have his book. I've studied it for years. I've talked to my colleagues about it. We all agree that Hapgood was right, and Einstein endorsed him because there was nothing else to do. I mean, either it is true or it is not. But when Hapgood began to try to theorize, naturally, how could this have happened, he came up with the crustal displacement theory, which has really suffered a lot since then. Hapgood died, unfortunately, young. He was killed by a hit-and-run driver, and that's what was really a tragedy. The crustal displacement theory, I think, was legitimate at the time that he made it, I guess in the early 60s, something like that. But I don't see it as a necessary explanation. It's a possible explanation, yes. I tried to be a scientist. I'm not a scientist in the sense that I have all kinds of degrees and PhDs. But anybody can be a scientist if they just keep an open mind and consider the information available to them in an unbiased way. This means that you cannot throw anything out, but you have to be discerning. You have to try to make sense of things. You have to be respectful to the evidence. Most scientists these days, accredited scientists, are not that. I won't go into that. But I think that what really happened, I think what explains Antarctica is that we're not looking at Antarctica many millions of years ago on the Perry Reese map. That was part of the criticism of it. Oh, how could people many millions of years ago know what the Perry Reese map, what Antarctica looked like? Well, they didn't many millions of years ago. But I think what has happened is that there has been major climate warming, or what they call global heating, going on. I don't think this is a new phenomenon at all. And there was a period of time, maybe only a few thousand years ago, in which, and it was related again perhaps to the phenomena, the catastrophe that brought the Ice Age to an end. Perhaps at that time there was excessive heat, and that shrank the ice back from the coasts of the continent, and that already civilization had developed, and it was mapped.
I just heard some reports just within the last couple of weeks that, now get ready, ladies and gentlemen, get ready. We may be entering a mini ice age, Frank, because the sun has what the scientific establishment stated is going into hibernation. Sunspots are at an absolute minimum.
Right.
In other words, the sun is becoming, for the want of a better turn of phrase, dormant. And we may be experiencing soon some unseasonably cool weather. Have you heard that?
Not only have I heard it, but I've written a book on it. It's called Atlantis and the Coming Ice Age. And I wrote that book about less than 10 years ago now.
See how I do that?
Thank you very much. And that book, I was wondering too, like everyone else, what is going on with climate change? What's the real story? And I came to the same conclusion that we are definitely headed towards another ice age. And it may not be a mini ice age. The last ice age lasted 120,000 years, and ours might do that too. These are cycles that are just part of the world we live in. And the sunspot activity, or the lack thereof, in connection with now the northern hemisphere gradually tilting away from the sun's direct rays, will cause this ice age. Will it happen tomorrow or next year? Probably not. But we may already be in this phase. The phase we're in now, the era, is called the Holocene epoch. And it's a warming phase. And it's been going on since the end of the last ice age, 11,000 years ago. And all climatologists are in agreement that we are close to the end of the Holocene. In human terms, we may still enjoy a few more generations, or more than a few generations, of relatively warm temperatures. But nonetheless, our descendants are going to be faced with an inevitable ice age. And it probably is being speeded up. That's the scary part. It's being speeded up by the behavior of the sun, which, as you say, is going into a dormant phase. That's absolutely correct. These dormant phases of the sun have been observed numerous times for thousands of years in relationship to the sunspots, again, as you say. So yes, we are definitely going into an ice age. It may not be so many. It may be for another 100,000 years or so, and it probably will be just as intense as the last one. I would say so. It's going to happen. It might happen.
That would play havoc with food production, wouldn't it?
Well, it doesn't. See, this is the thing. The ice age brings about very slow changes, and it also brings about very rapid changes at the same time. And I think we're seeing that right now. We're seeing a kind of climate destabilization going on, and that's because the temperatures are in flux. And so, yeah, we could experience something catastrophic, but in the long run, it would be a slow affair. It'd be a slow affair.
That can also affect the outbreak of viruses, can it?
Yes, it does. And the reason why it can do that is because if you have something locked up, let's say you have some unknown virus that killed off, say, the bison. We don't know that happened, but it's possible. So if you have a virus that exterminated the bison and they died in the tundra and conditions got very cold and they were locked up in the cold, things warm up and you have this alternation of temperature where it gets very hot and very cold just before the ice age. the same way the Ice Age is ending. You have these fluctuations of temperature where it's as though Mother Nature is trying to overcompensate for these extreme temperatures, extreme cold, and then she brings an extreme hot, and then the cold comes back again. And if those heating conditions, which are typical of Ice Age transitions, warm up the tundra where you have these bison that have all these viruses, you may then have a virus come out which can jump from one animal to the next. And that's what's happening with this coronavirus. The coronavirus, they now know, originated with a bat in China, and that it's the type of a virus which is not confined to a bat. It can jump into other species, and that's what it's done with us. And the same thing with the virus that perhaps killed off some other species that was safely locked up in the ice chest of the far north, and now things are warming up, and these viruses, they virtually never die. It's amazing. They survive
every year, Frank, I get an influenza vaccine shot, and I have for well over 35 years. And for the most part, I have been blessed by very seldom ever getting the flu. This past year was no different. I got my vaccination in October, I believe it was, and everything was fine until December. And suddenly I woke up in the wee hours one morning, just projectile vomiting. I mean, it was bad. I was down for 2 weeks. So I think they missed the boat this time. But then on the heels of that, I hear about this coronavirus. Now, what is your speculation? There's been a lot of doomsday talk about that. But so far, we've got under 20 reported cases in North America. What they don't talk about is the regular run-of-the-mill influenza that is raging across the country, and already in excess of 10,000 have died from the regular influenza. But you hear nary a word about that.
Well, there are over 100,000 people in China that do have the coronavirus. That's bad. I think the problem is Mother Nature is getting a little impatient with us. There's too many of us. Our relationship to the environment is not very good. It's certainly not getting better. And nature has this way of reasserting her balance, and she doesn't care how it's done. So we also are living in an over-urbanized society, so that if one person gets sick, everybody gets sick. In former times, say we're at the time of the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson suggested that Americans should not have cities. And the reason why he said that is because of all the filth and the disgusting conditions of London, say, in the 18th century, even Paris, the sewers of Paris. And the life expectancy, I think, of the average European at that time was like about 47 years old or something like that. And so what he suggested is that America should have cities that are merely cultural and commercial centers, but people should live in small villages. And one of the reasons why he specified this is because if there is some kind of an outbreak, some kind of a plague, it'll be confined more or less to those small villages and towns. Whereas if everybody's living in a great urban center, it will massacre the population. That's in fact what happens. So maybe that's the lesson that we need to learn from this, and we'll be taught that. Let's say that this coronavirus or some virus like it kills many millions of people, and that's not impossible. It's not an extremist thing to say at all. It's already happened with other viruses. Then maybe the lesson from that will be, all right, that's the end of the big cities. Look what they're doing with cruise ships. They are, in effect, floating cities, are they not? They've often been described as that. One person gets the coronavirus on board a ship, and the whole place has to be quarantined. Nobody can get off. And I think that this is probably the great lesson. I've been studying history all my life. It's my obsession, and it's my major focus of interest. How is it that our civilization has got to this point? What are its high points and low points? And one of the conclusions I come to is that the golden ages that our species has had have been primarily at times where there's been, not primarily, exclusively, when there's been a balance between human beings and nature. And when that imbalance takes place, that society is doomed. There hasn't been one that's survived when that imbalance really gets out of hand.
Well, the last great flu epidemic was in 1918 with the Spanish flu.
Killed more people than were lost during the war.
Exactly. Yes, I was going to say multiple millions died around the world. Multiple millions. And a few years ago, believe it or not, I read reports that whatever agency investigates chemical biological warfare, they were looking for complete DNA structures from the Spanish flu. They actually exhumed the graves of the dead from that period of time, looking for the genesis of where the hell that flu bug came from. And the consensus was it might, are you ready for this? It might have come from outer space. On a meteorite, a comet, something along those lines.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, interesting. Well, however, wherever it comes from, it's part of nature, and nature does not like things to get out of whack. She's very forgiving for things to become imbalanced, but she draws a line, and when that imbalance becomes intolerable to her, she reasserts that balance, sometimes in very violent ways. And if an entire species has to disappear, that's fine with her as far as she's concerned. It's the big natural mechanism that counts to her on Earth. And human beings have not been the very best custodians of our planet. So it's possible that we're facing some very serious challenges with this virus. And things
or
like
repercussions.
Repercussions, exactly. Well, I think it's possible that nature is, at least, if she doesn't want to exterminate us, as she has many other species, by the way, she may want to downsize us quite a bit. And that's the difficulty. As far as these viruses are concerned, of course, they mutate. That's the difficulty. You can go get a flu shot, just as you did, and that's very great. That's a great idea. But there are so many different types of viruses, and they mutate. They change, that you can't inoculate yourself against all possibilities. That's not to be hoped for, unfortunately. So hopefully they will find some way out. Now that they know that this is a animal bat origin for the virus, perhaps they can get a handle on it and save us.
Yeah, that's kind of a scary thing. Well, we're in the last few minutes of the show, Frank. Are you working on any new books at present? What have you been up to research-wise?
Well, my latest book has not yet come out, and I'm still sort of fine-tuning that, although it is going to be released later this year. It's called Ancient High Tech, and it's about some of the amazing levels of applied science that the ancients came up with, and in terms of medicine and warfare, of course, highly advanced things there. So I devoted quite a few chapters to some of the incredible work of our ancestors who, in some cases, were able to come up with technologies that are beyond our own. And so I was pretty impressed with that, like the underground cities that they built. Underground cities for literally hundreds of thousands of people, believe it or not, and mostly throughout Turkey. Some really great things. So that's the book now that I became very interested in. How far did the technological greatness of our ancestors go? And it appears it went very, very far.
How far back do you think the human race, Homo sapiens sapien, actually goes?
I cannot put any limit on it. Every time I've tried that, I've been surprised to learn that things are even older. I believe this, though, that our species, the human species, has completely matured and created great civilizations and wonderful societies and completely vanished. And I believe that we have evolved and devolved several times. How many times? I don't know. But the evidence suggests that the human species, as we know it today, our own species, yes, I can see our evolution the way that the experts have explained it to us, as the evolutionists have said. I really follow that. I believe that they are correct in showing our evolution over the last 2.5 million years. But we were preceded. There were other human beings that evolved many times. Well, I don't say many times, but several times at least, over the past many millions of years.
Of high intelligence, not our tree climbing ancestors.
No, high intelligence, technologically adept. And the reason I say that is because there are too many artifacts that have been found in a geological context that go back many millions of years ago. And we're talking about quite a few of them that have been found around the world. One of the things that's perplexing are human footprints that are found right alongside dinosaur footprints. So we're going
that was down in Texas, by golly.
Oh, they've been found all over the world. They've been found all across Russia, in Iraq.
Well, Frank, as much as I would love to go on another hour, my friend, we are totally out of time. This has been a distinct pleasure, Frank, and I want to take this opportunity to invite you back soon.
Well, I would like to do so. I feel we've just had a conversation and not really an interview, and that's the way it should be. And I much prefer something like that because you have offered as much to this conversation as I have.
Well, thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, DMR will be back again tomorrow with our open line show with Richard, Saturday, Mark Center, and yours truly. In the meantime, keep your eyes pointed up, your ear to the ground, and we'll see you then. Good night.